Cities are theaters for change and innovation, seats of power and crucibles of culture.
A city is a place of transactions, habitats of human civilization.
They are places where people from all walks of life commute, commune, and compete.
Anytime you've got a city with a highly educated workforce, it's going to be more productive.
By 2050, 68% of the global population will be living in cities that are already bursting at the seams, or moving into others that are yet to be conceived.
The art of planning is in the doing. You have a vision, it's got to be robust, but it's got to be flexible enough to change without losing the primary intent. And then you've got to totally commit to delivering it.
Never before has it been so imperative to get the recipe right. To create sustainable, livable cities that inspire and excite us all.
You've got to make sure that you have aspects and elements that you know people are going to enjoy, and the only way to ensure that is to make them part of the process of designing the city.
As we race towards a more urbanized future, there is much to learn from the present and the past. From the now, the how, and the wow of building the greatest cities in the world.
In a broad valley near the foothills of the Australian Alps stands Canberra, Australia's national capital.
I just love the fact that Canberra, capital of Australia, is also the bush capital.
The natural environment is all through Canberra. It's everywhere, and it's not parkland as such, it's bush, untouched.
It's like a work of art that you get to live in.
I love the benefit of Canberra being both big and small at the same time.
You know, it's not as vibrant as some of the bigger cities, but my day-to-day quality of life is unparalleled.
It's a really calm city. It has repose, it has grace.
And it's a place where you can make your mark. To my mind, it's one of the few places in Australia where if you want to, you can contribute to this city. And anything you do, you will see physically or intellectually blossom in this city. That's adventure.
So this is Canberra, a city built in the 20th century and thoroughly planned from the get-go.
You could be pulling the best out of other cities around the world, but we seem to have everything.
Amazing setup of the lake with the National Gallery, the High Court, Parliament House, National Library, beautiful architectural buildings sitting in the landscape.
We've got something that can always be exciting to the Canberra citizen.
To quote Edmund Bacon, a highly respected 20th century urban planner from America, Canberra is a statement of world culture that belongs among the greatest creations of man. Canberra was ranked by the OECD as the world's most livable city in 2014. People clearly come for the culture and stay for the lifestyle.
You cannot beat the drop-dead, beautiful landscape, this sort of vastness that stretches out to what we all think of as quintessential Australian bush. That is an exquisite landscape that completely surrounds the city from any vantage point. For me, being in a city that offers me everything from an urban lifestyle, in culture and understanding, but always having that connectedness to landscape is tremendously important. It's seductive beyond imagining.
The purpose-built capital of Australia is little more than a century old. In city years, that puts its development somewhere between adolescence and early adulthood.
Cities are like us as individuals, as people. We have a past, we have layers, we have signature experiences. Canberra's still very concerned about what other people think of it.
We've got through the growing pains, we've got the bones, the structure of the city, and now we're infilling, I suspect, both physically and culturally.
This is a city that's coming of age, not unlike many of its residents.
Canberra is one of the main centers of higher education in Australia, and a lot of people have come from overseas to study at places like the Australian National University or University of Canberra, which has just driven a very large number of individuals who have come, gotten a degree, and then looked around, seen that life is pretty good, and decided to stay.
I think there's 5 universities all told, so it's a university town, and I guess with all that comes with that, there's a lot of dynamism and ideas. It's a very, very innovative place. For example, patents per capita is double anywhere else in Australia.
It's producing ideas, information, knowledge, know-how. We live in the information world. Someone has to come to it, someone has to produce it, someone has to know it, someone has to show it, someone has to maintain it and move it forward. And Canberra is a big part of that story.
30% of the Canberra population has a university degree or higher, as opposed to about 16% for the nation as a whole. So that's a big difference. Also economically. So median incomes in Canberra are far higher than they are in almost anywhere else in Australia.
Adding to that advantage, the cost of living is 10% cheaper than Melbourne or Sydney. And where housing is concerned, Canberrans get 15% more bang for their buck. The city and its districts, which are slowly becoming micro-cities in their own right, are laid out in a wheel and spoke pattern rather than a Manhattan-style grid. They cover an area of 814 square kilometers and boast a density of fewer than 550 people per square kilometer.
It's fair to say Canberra's a city of suburbs, subdivisions. We're incredibly spread out. I think from end to end, we might be 30, 40, 50 kilometres. In terms of cities, we're incredibly not dense, if you like.
Bike tracks are plentiful, congestion is negligible, and peak hour is often just a matter of slowing down to 80 kilometres an hour.
I know people talk about the 20-minute city or the 30-minute city. We have it, we've had it for years, and it's because we've been able to plan our development with our transport.
Canberra, Australia's young federal capital city, was built on beautiful pastoral land designed by men who visualized a city of beauty and symmetry.
The location and layout of the landscape were key considerations in Canberra's creation, a city that was thoroughly planned from the outset.
The Australian colonies federated in 1901, and so there was a need for it to be the capital city where the federal parliament would be, and there were a number of places were put up as options.
35 sites were suggested, and quite vigorously contested by the powers that be.
And we ultimately get a Seat of Government Act in 1908 that says it's going to be Yes Canberra.
Canberra came almost out of nowhere. I mean, it started as a compromise between Sydney and Melbourne, who could not decide on where to put the capital, and so they wound up putting it kind of in the foothills of the Australian Alps.
The Federation of Australia's founding fathers were sticklers for the democratic process. They had a vision for their capital, but well understood the role consensus would play in bringing it to fruition.
Well, this is the making of a grand idea. You know, it's the full art of planning and development. This is the politicians taking on this extraordinary idea at the start of the turn of the 20th century. The practicality, the functionality, the transport, where people live, where people work, etc. But the most important thing was that it was trying to inscribe culture into space and values. You know, who the hell were we? What was Australia? And what should this place do in the middle of the bush?
With round one of how to build a city successfully completed, Parliament moved to source an appropriate design.
It's a time when international thoughts about planning are flourishing, and they decide to have an international competition.
The competition is a runaway success. Entry number 29 comes from Chicago, from Walter and Marion Griffin.
From a city that would ironically establish itself as the home of the skyscraper, came a series of beautiful low-rise renderings inspired by Ebenezer Howard's Garden City.
Canberra has rightly been called the Garden City. She has adopted the advantages of other great cities, whilst avoiding those features which are not in keeping with the principles of modern town planning.
The Griffins pulled off an act of incredible foresight that without visiting the site, they were able to read the maps and read the photographs so intuitively that they truly understood the landscape.
They envisage a city that reflects the politician's brief, this ideal city. And they pick up with remarkable sensitivity the notion of taking a very robust geometry, spatial plan with beautiful simplicity and layering it on this landscape.
And the act of making the city subservient to the natural landform was, I think, is the true act of genius.
On the 12th of March 1913, the city's foundation stones were laid.
Extraordinary thing about Canberra is what they achieved in that first 20 years of federation. They select the site, then they select a winning design, which is an extraordinary one. Then they name the city of Canberra and they lay the foundation stones and they get on with the construction of the city. Can you imagine achieving all of that now in less than 20 years in the middle of a bush setting?
In 1914, the Griffins moved to Canberra to oversee the realization of their vision for the nation's capital. But they locked horns on a number of occasions with the meddling bureaucracy of the day.
When the Griffin plan came in, it was viewed by some as a bit too idealistic and not very practical. So the plan for the first few years was ignored as much as it was followed.
They wanted a democratic city for a democratic people. They said themselves that they had bold, new, radical ideas. But as we know only too well, and every architect is always going to tell you, the difference between the design and its realisation are often very, very vastly apart. But Walter holds on to that, and certainly the idea of a democratic capital. He won't let go. So when you finally come out of the Great War years, and Australia is massively in debt, we've lost 60,000, the highest per capita rate of any participant nation in the Great War. There is no money. There's certainly no money to build the national capital. That's when Walter is basically told either you're a member of a committee or you leave. And Walter says, well, I'm out the door, and is.
In the time that Walter Burley Griffin was appointed to the commission to plan Canberra, he was only able to establish the road system, and a radial road system has given us a structure, a framework that, you know, even we are able to work with and respect, and it delivered benefits to us that we couldn't even anticipate at the time.
The common wisdom is things stopped between the wars. I think the truer story is the remarkable manner in which many things happened that underpinned the future development of the city. So between the wars, what you get is the development of key service infrastructure, the powerhouse for electricity, the brickworks, the Cotter Dam for water. We have the parks, we have the public places. We might not have the population yet, but we have all those in place. They're ready for the audience. And we have the connectivity between our homes and our places of work.
In 1927, when the Provisional Parliament House finally opened, the population of Canberra was still relatively scant, just 5,915 souls.
In a sense, it was a country town with a Parliament House.
The sense of isolation that must have accompanied people's everyday life, I almost can't comprehend how that would have been to experience it.
Of course, more people came once the seat of power had been established, with the first of what would eventually amount to 106 high commissions and embassies opening in the late 1930s, and more again in the wake of World War II.
After the Second World War, there was a move for some national development, an irrigation scheme to improve the irrigation capacity of the Murrumbidgee system, and to produce some electricity by hydro generation at the same time.
One of the world's largest earth and rock-filled dams, when completed, would be the heart of the scheme from which water could be diverted either to the Murray or Murrumbidgee systems.
The Snowy Scheme was a monumental undertaking, the largest civil engineering project in Australia's history. A quarter of a century in the making. It employed more than 100,000 people, 70% of whom were immigrants.
There were 16 dams, there were 7 hydropower stations, 2 of them deep underground.
There was a pumping station and 225 kilometers of tunnels, pipelines, and aqueducts, all built for a total cost of $820 million, yet worth infinitely more in terms of what it did for the nation.
It transferred engineering skills to Australia, built Australia's infrastructure, developed a multicultural aspect to Australia. So, very important project for us, and I think for Australia's pride in what could be done in Australia too.
The Snowy Hydro continues to feed into the national electricity grid that runs from Rockhampton in Queensland right down the east coast of Australia to Adelaide and Tasmania, providing 4,000 megawatts of renewable electricity and 2,100 gigalitres of water for irrigation every year. And moves are afoot to expand the scheme further.
The idea is to expand Australia's existing Snowy Mountains hydropower system to allow for pumped hydro energy storage, which essentially uses 2 reservoirs to move water from the lower point to the high point at a time of cheap power, and then essentially run it back through the turbine at a time of scarcity when the prices are high. So the idea is that will obviously allow for a significant amount of new energy storage that will then support quite a high amount of renewable generation, of variable renewable generation, particularly in Australia's southeast.
I find it difficult to realise that all this has grown up in 50 short years. It is a wonderful achievement and an inspiring sight to see a great and gracious city taking shape almost before one's eyes.
So it wasn't until 1960 that the population of Canberra reached over 50,000 people. And that kind of marked a very quick change in Canberra, that sort of late 50s, early 60s, where population growth just skyrocketed.
In the 60s, there was a lot of activity, and Australia was really enamoured of the English Newtown planning. And we imported a lot of architects and planners, and we saw a value in the idea around satellite cities, where you have the mothership and then smaller entities. Great idea at the time when we were in the thrall of the vehicle.
The creation of Lake Burley Griffin on the floodplain of the Molonglo River came to pass in 1964. It was one of the first major projects undertaken by the NCDC, the National Capital Development Commission, the organization charged with overseeing the build-out of Canberra between 1958 and 89. Covering an area of 664 hectares and forming the immediate foreground of the parliamentary zone, it is the jewel in the capital's crown.
The lake is our element of drama in a city of subtlety and nuance.
In the competition, they talked about an ornamental water feature, which Griffin then translated in the magnificent way that he did, of this major recreation space at the heart of the city, connecting it all.
It was changed in the sense that the Griffin Lake wasn't all at the one level, and it had much more of a geometric shape. So it's still recognisably the same, but it's softer edges. It has less of what would have been required for the civil engineering part to make it as geometric as it was.
That said, it was still quite a complex undertaking, utilizing technology and engineering science that was, at the time, cutting edge. The scheme required the construction of a dam complete with hydraulic floodgates to regulate the level of the lake, and several pre-stressed concrete bridges to facilitate inner city to suburban connections.
It changed it from being 2 half places separated by a floodplain and a river that sometimes had water in it and sometimes didn't, to being a unified city. So it was a major achievement.
And there's no question that if you start to look, in my mind, at the great moves in Canberra, post that early establishment, the lake is one of them, and the building of the permanent Parliament House is the second. Once that happens, it pretty much affirms the plan, and it affirms Canberra as the seat of government.
Around the same time the lake was receiving approval, another equally remarkable engineering wonder landed on the landscape of Canberra, the home of the Academy of Science, or in today's parlance, the Shine Dome.
The Academy of Science is a fun, gorgeous building. Celebration of science, the importance of it, people meeting to discuss matters of import, is a wonderful building in Canberra.
The relatively blank canvas of Canberra at that time was the perfect place for modernists to flex their architectural muscle.
It's a low domed shaped reinforced concrete structure with a moat around the outside and a series of arches around the edges of the dome which allow you to look into the moat. So it's a really pleasing, unusual building.
Created in the era of Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, it was lauded for its futuristic demeanor.
It's got various nicknames, including the Martian Embassy.
Designed by architect Roy Grounds, many doubted the dome could be built. Was it possible for 710 tons of concrete to perch on such slender supports? Would the dome collapse when the scaffold was taken away?
It was a much flatter dome than the traditional domes, and so there was the question of making sure that it was going to be self-supporting and structurally sound. And so there was physical modelling done to ensure that it wouldn't drop too much. And it worked out precisely the way it was designed.
Getting the roof right was one small step for man, and the lecture theatre beneath it, one giant leap for mankind.
When it opened up, first few lectures in there, people were motion sick. And they realised that the way that the lecture theatre had been designed had created an optical illusion that you were moving, like you're on a ship.
To counter a problem the theatre had with its acoustics, engineers had installed a series of wooden baffles into the wall panels, which, rather unexpectedly, created an optical interference that made people uncomfortably nauseous.
They had to insert a whole lot of basically strings of wire and I think cotton, other materials down between all these wooden battens around the lecture theatre so that you didn't feel like you were sitting there a little bit queasy while you're in your lecture.
The Shine Dome continues to amuse locals and visitors alike, and while Martians are yet to seek asylum in the city, the search for extraterrestrial life continues on the ridge above it.
Mount Stromlo Observatory, Canberra, a national lookout post where men keep watch on the sun. Solar observation is of great importance in the study of weather prediction and the vital problem of drought.
Space has been a part of the integral nature of Canberra since its birth. One of the benefits of being in Canberra is less people, less lights, darker skies. That's what we want in astronomy. Places that are not only dark, but also very radio quiet.
Mount Stromlo is the world-renowned headquarters of the Australian National University Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics.
Started as an observatory back in 1911, actually before Canberra was even built. And since then, we've done all sorts of things, even through today, and have turned from a solar observatory to monitor the sun, to nighttime observatories, to being the center of testing and designing satellites for the Australian government and all sorts of groups in Australia. Because ultimately, if you need to go into the southern part of the skies or southern part of the universe, you have to be on the bottom part of the world, depending on your angle. That's why the observatory was set up, but that's also why the Canberra has grown as being a big space player.
One of the tracking stations was instrumental in broadcasting the moon landing in 1969.
An extraordinary piece of technology that enabled mankind to watch man walking on the moon. Now still in use at the Canberra Deep Space Centre, it was one of just 3 tracking stations following the moon landing, and the one that worked at the crucial moment.
The Apollo 11 moon landing was seen from Canberra because of this being the capital city in the bush. That decision, 61 years before, was what led to seeing that first moon landing. One of the things Canberra has is lots of institutes doing lots of things in space. We have people who are looking upward, but we also have groups looking downward, trying to understand the environment and how drought can affect it. And this has created kind of an ecosystem, a way where people want to come in and work.
The Canberra Deep Space Communication Complex, just 35 kilometers southwest of the city, is a vital listening post in NASA's Deep Space Network that continues to contribute to the international profile of the capital.
So we regularly are working with our overseas partners in NASA or the Japanese Space Agency, or now India or Europe or SpaceX. And because we have that benefit of being the capital and being let out and being set up so people from overseas can go get the government decisions and go do the work all in one-stop shop, we've really been viewed in space as the Southern Hemisphere equivalent of what DC would be to NASA.
The space community contributes significantly to the intellectual orbit of Canberra. But an even greater portion of the smart city populace have hitched their wagons to the star that is the Australian Public Service.
This city was designed as a government place, and government used to be the only industry of the city. We don't make those kind of equipment. We don't have a manufacturing base. We are not a port city. We in this city make knowledge, educate students, invent things, and more importantly, we make decisions and policies with national influence and global outreach.
The public service, while proportionally diminished in recent years, still accounts for around 40% of Canberra's workforce. Most are employed by government departments located in fairly nondescript buildings throughout the city and its satellites. But a select few get to spend their days here, in the hallowed halls of New Parliament House.
It is the symbol of the capital, and it works, and it is a beautiful Parliament House.
Opening in 1988, the building replaced the Provisional Parliament House, which was no longer big enough to accommodate the nation's politicians.
Population had grown to the extent that the Provisional Parliament House was very overcrowded.
By the 1980s, I think there were 3,000 people working in a building designed for 300.
As adept as politicians are at pressing the flesh, the act had become uncomfortably literal.
It was diabolical to work in. People were absolutely on top of each other.
And so they decided to build something a little bit bigger. It was this massive, huge expanse of a building.
The Australian people flip-flopped about the location, the siting of it. An elevated hilltop location or down on the lake edge.
Ultimately, Capitol Hill was chosen, the site where Canberra's foundation ceremony was held and the city duly named.
And then there followed some national conversation about the characteristics of the building, and that culminated in the International Design Competition.
The $600,000 competition to design a new Parliament House behind the existing building will run over the next 12 months and be open only to Australian registered architects. The quoted price of the building is $151 million, but do we face the prospect of another opera house?
99% of those submissions were incredibly prosaic and incredibly unexciting. They were basically all varieties of an office building. And one competition entry was outstanding in its difference, in its freshness, its ability to draw connections with the Griffin plan, and its supreme connection with the landscape. So not only did it answer the brief best, but it also created a fundamental dialogue with the Griffin's plan.
10,000 Australians were involved in bringing Mitchell, Giorgola and Thorpe's winning design to fruition, working tirelessly over a period of 7 years. welding 20,000 tons of steel, pouring 180,000 cubic meters of concrete, handcrafting thousands of unique pieces of furniture and elaborate fixtures for the interior.
The people that worked on those interiors, it brought the concept of art in architecture back to Australia.
Canberra's Parliament House is the largest building in Australia. It cost £500 million. It's also twice the size of the Palace of Westminster, and it's a project much criticised for its extravagance.
I think one of the most important characteristics of Canberra is that the built form and the web of infrastructure is constantly subservient to the natural landform. The new Parliament building is of the hill. It recreates the hill. And the fact that the building in itself does not appear monumental, its sheer capacity is actually disguised through how it's embedded into the hill. But the fact that the people retain dominion over the building is the ultimate expression of democracy.
Yes, it was massively over budget, but several decades on, there is little to fault.
The building is so fulsome. It is so designed. Every aspect of it, every room, every finish, every element is designed. And I can get architectural exhaustion, within a couple of metres of the front door. I find that level of design integrity and the tireless exploration of the philosophy of the building and bringing it to fruition, it's almost beyond comprehension. So for me, the building delivers opportunity, it delivers aspiration. It never constrains or never holds down. And when I go to the Parliament building now, it's like tucking in for a degustation meal.
I think that the way that the parliamentary zone's been used over the years, full of controversy. The V8 car races was a great one. Cirque du Soleil was there. There's been equestrian show jumping in the parliamentary area, but that's the way it should be used. I mean, it's an equitable space. It's not a precious space. And provided it contributes to people coming together of all walks of life and interest, why not? Isn't that what it was intended to do? And so you've got a very formal composition, but an egalitarian use. And there'll be more of that over time. And it's fantastic.
Indeed, it's probably one of, if not the, only Parliament House on the planet you can glide over in a balloon full of hot air, an irony the majority of Canberrans clearly relish.
It's gorgeous first that we can use the heart of our parliamentary area to heat up hot air balloons, and great jokes around that, they're obvious. But to be able to do that and have all these people come down at dawn to watch them inflate and then take off in this big sky immediately over our city and stretch off to that landscape beyond, that beautiful setting, is magical. It's full of sort of brashness and brightness and fun, sheer fun. And it happens right in front of our Parliament House.
Perhaps the most iconic feature of the building is its gargantuan flagpole and the impact that had on the profile of the city. Visible from multiple vantage points, the pole is 81 meters tall, weighs 220 tons, and is still one of the largest stainless steel structures in the world. The flag is enormous, 12.8 meters by 6.4, which is roughly the same size as the side of a double-decker bus.
There was controversy about the flagpole. Was it an American symbol? Do Australians raise their flag? Would it be too high? And of course, it established a benchmark for heights throughout the central area, the infamous RL617, which is the base of the flagpole. A nonsense idea, in my view, not a good way to control height, but nevertheless, it had a marked impact on planning.
structures within Canberra's parliamentary and central city precincts are not permitted to rise more than 617 metres above sea level, which, given the altitude and topography of Canberra, generally limits residential and commercial blocks to around 14 stories, depending on the site and ceiling heights.
So you get flat roofs and you get them all at the same height. It's such a disappointment. And what would be a better planning construct would be to look at, well, what are the primary vistas that need to be retained? What criteria can we put in place to protect primary views and vantage points? And then look at the environmental impacts of overshadowing and do those as performance criteria and make judgments accordingly. That would be a far better model, and I really hope that happens very soon, because to not address it with the amount of development happening in the central areas would really leave us with an incredibly mediocre, boring skyline.
So if you're going to do density, let's do it well. That's the real topic for Canberra, not whether we should have it or not, it's how we do it well.
Every city deserves the opportunity to consider the drama, the density, the excitement in the city, I think. And high-rise is a big part of that. I mean, it can work for us in so many ways. It'll work for us in doing the heavy lifting of accommodating people and providing those fundamental facilities.
As the population and clearly popularity of Canberra continues to swell, a tsunami of urban designers are clamoring for the abolition of the RL 617 rule. Their caveat, however, is that developers respect and maintain the green space.
You have great vistas as you drive. It's a great environment as you drive. But those green spaces often aren't used.
I can't think of any other city in the world where you look to the left, look to the right. Mainly you just see grass and trees. We have a no billboards policy, so there's no advertising, there's no fences. It feels like you're in the great open expanses of the outback.
This balance of light and space, courtesy of the Griffin's Plan and its deference to the Garden City movement, has left Canberra with an enviable legacy. Its inner-city suburbs feature wide, tree-lined verges, magnificent gardens and parks that were created to act as windbreaks.
We've got the great bones of green infrastructure, and I think we're on a great journey to maximise its use or to get more value out of it.
This will become an increasingly important issue as densification inevitably intensifies.
Our sort of the stated planning target to cater for our growth is through 70% infill, 30% greenfields. So really probably changing the dial on what Canberra's done for the last 100 years, which is predominantly greenfields development.
The news is not all bad for the city's card-carrying tree huggers, who need look no further than the new Acton precinct to see what the future holds.
That entire precinct on the edge of the municipal core of Civic was surrounded by a chain wire fence for many, many years.
It's a great example of a precinct-scale development. They've integrated great landscape architecture, urban design, ideas about vibrancy, access to amenity, human-scale laneways, little parks. Not everything has to be, huge. That's what I like about what we could do in the future. It's just more human-scale development, more local scale.
It's become a major pull for tourists, but more importantly, a major place for Canberrans to go and celebrate and enjoy just living here. And it's really an exemplar, I think, of precinctual development.
Densification doesn't mean encroachment into green space. You build more levels and you have more floor space, but the green space is still there. The new technology can green the building itself. So the definition and the standard of green space is also changing. We don't have to make things contradictory conceptually, and we try to find how those seemingly contradictory elements can actually balance or work together to create an interesting and an organic urban structure.
You want every city to be different, to be unique, to be idiosyncratic. You want a city to have an identity.
The green is connected. There are walking networks and cycle networks. It's a fundamental underpinning to the physicality of Canberra. That's an indelible part of our fabric.
2/3 or so of Canberra is national parks or reserves, which is fantastic to go and explore. However, of course, with the drying of the climate and the heating up of the climate, bushfires are becoming more and more of a danger.
Until Saturday, this was a suburban street straight out of an Australian soap. Now, most of the houses in Apalock Road, Canberra, are charred ruins.
In 2003, 500 or so homes were obliterated by a bushfire which came over the Brindabella Mountains from Canberra's west into the suburbs. Canberra wasn't quite ready for it.
We never thought that could happen.
We've always had grass fires around the place, grass and small bushfires. The Christmas fires of 2001, and then the major fire, which was just catastrophic for Canberra in 2003.
The whole place just went up that quick. It was ridiculous.
Everything was on fire. I mean, everything. It's just the fences are on fire. The houses were starting to ignite. There was just a sea of ember. It was just a wave.
Personal losses were profound. 435 people were injured. 4 lost their lives.
There was just total devastation as far as you could see. It was just, it was like a war zone.
Almost 70% of the ACT's forests, national parks, and pasture lands were burnt, and key pieces of infrastructure destroyed, including the Mount Stromlo Observatory.
No other observatory or space research center has undergone what we went through. We are the largest insurance claim in Australian history, just to put that into scale. We lost multiple buildings and instruments and houses, but it wasn't the end. It was a way to reset.
People here are reacting to this disaster with a resilience that is frankly astonishing. But the initial shock is not yet over, and a long and painful period of rebuilding lies ahead.
It's a cliche, but it does come with the territory. If you're going to have bush around you, then you're always going to be aware that you've got to have fire policy to protect your home.
The structure of our suburbs provides almost an invitation to fire. We have fingers of bush coming right into the suburb, and then many lily pads of bush within the suburbs. And we didn't realise it at the time, but we now can see that these are potentially landing spots for wildfire.
Well, I think the building code changed after that, with houses and properties that are on the abatement zones.
But that as it may, those changes did little to quell the fear in Canberra during the summer of 2019-2020.
This summer we spent in fear of our lives.
Not even a week into 2020, and already this is a year no Australian will forget.
A pall of smoke blanketed the city for days on end, up to 26 times higher than the hazardous levels for human health.
Going forward, we need to think about our footprint for sustainability reasons, but we also need to think about it in terms of capacity to deal with environmental elements that never occurred to us that could happen, that fires of such ferocity could sweep across our city.
Where transport's concerned, Canberra is starting to notch a few wins.
We have amazingly high level of service, I think, across a lot of our infrastructure because of good planning, good engineering, good design. Because we're a planned city, it's a very easy place to get around.
Recent improvements in the public transport sector are finally giving Canberrans more incentive to ditch their dependency on cars.
In the government's new climate strategy, there is a commitment to electrify the bus fleet by 2040.
Light rail is obviously the biggest thing that's happened in Canberra in terms of transport in the last 50 years or so.
And that was absolutely groundbreaking. It gave a really visible and trustworthy public transport system.
The initial 12-kilometre line from Gungahlin, the fastest growing suburb in Australia, to the city centre, set a benchmark in sustainable design and delivery. $32 million under budget, it is powered by 100% renewables and features a state-of-the-art storage system inside the trams. enabling them to operate without catenaries.
In terms of our journey of densification, it makes perfect sense to invest in light rail. Light rail does something that the bus network doesn't do. It attracts investment, it attracts people. And we've seen that on our light rail corridor. If government spent $700 million on the light rail, I think the private sector's invested way more than that in terms of residential and commercial infrastructure on the route. And people are choosing to live next to the light rail route because of the advantages it brings them. So the proof is in the pudding, I think, in terms of how people are using it, how it's been received.
The COVID-19 pandemic threw a spanner in the light rail's works. But since lockdown restrictions were eased, its ridership is back on track. Notwithstanding the fact that many Canberrans are choosing to continue to work from home, thus negating the need for any form of commute.
This is one moment in time where that comfortable density delivered a dividend to us, in that it was relatively straightforward for Canberrans to isolate, to work from home, that we do have good internet access, that people do have relatively comfortable homes that they can occupy, that there are many parks and those hills and ridges, all those decompression spaces. The rug's just been pulled from under our feet and how we assume we work. I think it'll change our ways of thinking for the better.
Canberra's sprawling, Canberra's green space, Canberra's low density, that has been criticized in recent decades, proved to be a contributory factor to our fight against the pandemic.
And the message is clear though. Stay home, don't travel, don't go away. We can't let up now.
In dealing with sort of a disease threat like COVID, where it's being passed person to person, density is not a good thing. So you think of a place like New York, where most people are getting around on mass transit, subway systems, etc. That's great from an environmental perspective. It's great from an economic perspective. It does not work very well when you're trying to keep people from getting a highly infectious disease. And the sort of Canberra model that we have been treating as somewhat outdated, where it's spaced a bit around the car with some walking and some biking, is actually a quite safe way of living through a pandemic like this, because you limit your face-to-face contact with other people. Ways of how we can make density safe is going to be a big challenge of the future, but thankfully living in Canberra, it's one that we're not going to have to worry about as much as sort of much denser places.
The pandemic is actually teaching us that, human connection is so important. And, I think cities are obviously a great place to do that. And this has probably taught us or reminded us that we need to sort of lift our gaze from the phones and listen and talk to the people that are around us. And with luck, that will help us solve some of the challenges that are in front of us.
I'm very hopeful that we can still grow and get better and better as we grow. So what I hope to see is that as we densify in our town centres, that idea of a walking city becomes more prominent, more available to people. And
does have the potential to really be sort of an important city in the knowledge economy. Regional offices of companies that probably 20 or 30 years ago would have been in Sydney or Melbourne are starting to pop up in Canberra a bit more, because they can draw on a very highly educated workforce.
The way in which we establish our suburbs is probably the singular most important challenge in our planning, I think, in the next 10 to 20 years, because we don't want suburbs that are heat sinks. We don't want suburbs where all of the houses look the same, where you don't have privacy, where you don't have character.
What people really love about Canberra is the sheer amount of open space, and we need to arrive at an understanding that we will curate those green spaces in perpetuity, that they will have a connectivity, they'll have a relation to the landform and the landscape. I want to see us build more on those incredibly subtle connections to landscape and to landform.
The tricky part is that we need to achieve a balanced development of economy, environment, and society, because certain elements of them are intrinsically contradictory. So the balance is the key, and it's also the trickiest part of building a resilient city.